All right, let's talk about cheating. We're going to step into the, surprisingly complicated world of marital infidelity, but we're not looking at it like a soap opera. Nope, we're looking at it through the cold, hard lens of the law. You see, you should think of marriage as a formal contract, kind of like an official agreement that comes with its own rulebook. And today, we are diving deep into that rulebook, specifically the chapter on infidelity, to figure out how the law defines the foul, who gets the penalty, and maybe most importantly, why the rules aren't always the same for everyone. So let's just start with the big question, the one that gets right to the heart of this whole thing. Is every single act of cheating a crime in the eyes of the law? And, follow-up question, does the law judge a husband who cheats by the exact same standard it uses for a wife who cheats? This is really the core of our entire explainer today. It sets up this fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty controversial legal difference that people have been debating for years. So here's our game plan. First, we'll cover the basics, why marriage is a legal contract. Then, we're going to define the two key crimes in our story. Adultery, which is her crime, and concubinage, which is his. After that, we'll put them head-to-head, compare the penalties, and then we'll wrap up by asking, what this legal imbalance really means today. Okay, Section 1. So, first things first, why is the law getting all up in people's personal business? Well, it's because, legally speaking, marriage is a civil contract. And just like any official game with rules, when a really key term of that contract gets broken, the law steps in. It sees it as a legal foul, not just a personal heartbreak. Now, the phrase to really focus on here is sanctity of marriage. The law isn't just playing marriage counselor between two people. It sees itself as protecting the institution of marriage. From this point of view, the crime isn't just a personal betrayal. It's seen as a social harm, something that can shake the foundation of the family unit, and by extension, the community. So the damage isn't just emotional, it's considered a moral and social problem. All right, let's get specific. Time to zoom in on the rules for a married woman. The crime is called adultery, and it's laid out with some serious precision in Article 333 of the law books. So let's break down exactly what this means, piece by piece. Okay, this is the actual legal language, and trust me, every single word in there matters. So let's unpack it. First, it points to the main offender, a married woman. Then it specifies the act, sexual intercourse with a man, not her husband. Simple enough. But then the law points to a second offender, the man involved. But, and this is a huge but, with the condition that he did it knowing her to be married. This one sentence really sets up everything we need to know about this crime. So let's boil it down. Adultery is defined by one specific action. It's almost like a recipe for a crime, right? You take one married woman, you add sexual intercourse with a man who is not her husband, and boom, the result is the crime of adultery. It is a very direct, very action-based definition. So, who can actually get charged here? Well, first, obviously, the married woman. She's considered the principal offender. But second, her male partner can also be charged, but only under that critical condition. The prosecutor has to prove he knew she was married. That knowledge is the absolute key to his guilt. If he didn't know, he hasn't committed this specific crime. Now, this brings us to a super important point about the physical act itself, what lawyers call the actus reus. For adultery, the law sets the bar, well, pretty low. Just one single instance of sexual intercourse is enough to make it a crime. There's no need to prove there was some ongoing affair, or a public relationship, or any kind of emotional connection. Think of it like a tripwire. One touch, one single act, and the legal alarm goes off. Okay, so what about the mental state, the mens rea, or the guilty mind? Well, for the married woman, her intent is pretty much assumed by the act itself. But for her partner, the law requires something very specific. He must have known she was married. Why? Well, because the law is punishing him for knowingly taking part in breaking her marriage vows. If he honestly, genuinely thought she was single, he doesn't have that guilty mind, and that ignorance could actually be his defense. Okay, here's a classic law school style what if for you. Let's say the act happens, but then months, maybe even years later, the marriage is annulled. It's legally declared void, as if it never existed. So does that go back in time and erase the crime of adultery? And the answer is a big, clear no. The law works like a camera. It takes a snapshot of the facts at the exact moment the act took place. At that specific point in time, was she legally married? If the answer is yes, then the crime was committed. A future annulment can't time travel to change the legal reality of that moment. It's kind of like a foul in a football game, right? Even if the game gets forfeited later, that foul still happened and it's still on the record.
So we've just seen the very clear single-act rule for a married woman. Now, let's flip the coin over and look at the law for a married man. This crime is called concubinage, and as you're about to see, the rule book for it is written in a very, very different way.
So let's start with the basic definition. Concubinage is the crime a husband commits, but right away you can spot the massive difference. It's not about a single act. It has to be done in one of three very specific ways. This tells us immediately that proving this crime is going to be way more complicated than proving adultery. So here they are, the only three ways to commit this crime. 1. He keeps a mistress in the marital home. 2. He has sexual intercourse, but, and this is key, under scandalous or public circumstances. Or 3, he lives together with another woman anywhere else. Now the huge takeaway here is this. A single, secret act of sex by a husband is not a crime under this law. Not enough. So what in the world are scandalous circumstances? This is a really important legal term. Think of it like the difference between a whisper and a shout. The law on adultery for her is concerned with the private whisper, the secret act. But this law for him is only concerned with the public shout, behavior that's so open and in your face that it offends the community's sense of decency. The focus completely shifts from the act of cheating itself to the public mess it creates. And who can be charged? Well, the husband, he's the main offender. His partner, the concubine, she's also liable, but, and here is another giant difference from adultery, she isn't charged with the same crime. Nope. Instead, she faces a totally separate and much lesser penalty.
Okay, we have now officially examined both sides of this legal coin. We've looked at the rules for her, adultery, and the rules for him, concubinage. So now, let's put them right next to each other in a head-to-head showdown to really see just how fundamentally different these two laws are.
So, to recap for the wife, the crime of adultery gets triggered by one single act. It is a clear, bright line, one act of infidelity, and that's all the law needs to see. But for the husband, the crime of concubinage is defined by the circumstances around the relationship, not just the act itself. The context is everything, and that makes proving it a whole lot harder. This table really just lays it all out. Look at the act. One act for her versus one of three specific conditions for him. That creates a huge gap in proof. For her, you just need proof of intercourse. For him, you need proof of these complex circumstances. And finally, partner's guilt. Her partner is an equal participant in the very same crime, while his partner commits a totally separate, lesser offense. It's just different across the board. So with such different definitions and different standards of proof, it probably won't surprise you to hear that the penalties are also pretty different. So what happens when someone is actually found guilty? Let's break down the consequences for each crime. I mean, this bar chart just makes the difference impossible to ignore. For adultery, the crime for a married woman, the maximum possible prison sentence is 6 years. For concubinage, the crime for a married man, the max is way lower, 4 years and 2 months. The visual tells a very clear story here about unequal consequences. And looking at the full penalty ranges, the gap is still there. For adultery, you're looking at a sentence from about 2.5 years all the way up to 6 years. For concubinage, it's much lower, from just 6 months up to about 4 years. The bottom line is clear. Both the minimum and the maximum penalties are harsher for adultery. Now, there is one interesting exception here for adultery. The law does recognize that if a husband just up and abandons his wife without a good reason, her guilt is seen as less severe. In that specific scenario, her penalty gets lowered. It brings her potential sentence down to a range of about 6 months to 2 years and 4 months, which you'll notice is much closer to the penalty for concubinage. And what about the concubine, the husband's partner? She doesn't face jail time. Instead, she faces this thing called destierro. And what is that? It's basically a penalty of banishment. Think of it as a legally enforced restraining order. A judge will literally forbid her from going within a certain distance of the offended wife's home. So you can think of it as being geographically grounded by the court. It's a penalty designed more to stop conflict than to punish with prison. So we have walked through the definitions, the proof you need, and the punishments. We've seen a legal system that defines the crime of infidelity in 2 totally different ways, with 2 different standards of proof and 2 different sets of consequences, all based on the gender of the married person. And this brings us to our final section, a chance to step back and just think about the balance, or maybe imbalance, of it all. And this leads us to our final question, the one this entire deep dive has been building towards. In a world that's trying harder and harder to achieve equality before the law, is there still a place for laws that create such a clear difference in how they treat men and women for a very similar act? It's a question about justice, it's a question about changing social norms, and it's really a question about the fundamental role of law in our modern relationships. And we'll just leave you to think about that one.